Kelly, no comment from the officials here at the White House on the president's decision, why he reversed course, who was with him at the time he did. I just spoke with somebody in the West Wing who was in the Oval Office moments ago. They're offering no color, no insight, no context here to the president's decision, just saying simply the truth speaks for itself. That is the Truth Social post that the president put up on social media. I can tell you that I was standing next to some lower level aides in the West Wing when this hit the wires. None of them were in a position to expect this, and all of them were surprised to see it. The president had given no indication that he was thinking about reversing course on the future of his tariff program. Obviously, he's bifurcating his response here. One response for China, one response for the rest of the world. They had told me here at the White House earlier today that there were more than 70 countries that had sought negotiations with the White House. The president suggesting in his report, in his post just now, that number is 75 nations. So clearly this is a sudden pivot and reversal by this White House, and aides here are not in a position right now to offer any kind of context or insight into why the president did what he did. What we do know is that there were reports off of Capitol Hill that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was set to meet with a number of Republicans on the Hill. That meeting was canceled. Bessent was said to be headed to a meeting at the White House. Presumably that has something to do with this. We haven't quite connected those dots just yet, though, Kelly, to know exactly who was in the Oval Office with the president at the time that the president made this decision. I'm just checking to make sure that there's a Marine at the West Wing door here to indicate that the president is indeed in the West Wing, and that is the case. So the president is here. We don't know who's in the Oval Office with him, and we don't know why he made this decision, Kelly. Okay. Right. So the question is, if these tariffs were the thing driving them to the table, as you point out, why take them off now if they're already at the table and you've got the pressure succeeding and the sense of urgency on the other side? You know, the market was up today, you know, leading into this, but you also had this dynamic of the Treasury market and bond yields spiking overnight, and you know, real concerns about what that meant for the future of the U.S. economy. So it may be that the president decided that enough is enough here in terms of economic pain. He's got people at the table, and he's prepared to declare victory.
Absolutely. A little bit more color, Kelly, that we're getting from the Commerce Secretary posting on X saying that he and the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who we know had just canceled that meeting with members of Congress, sat with the president while he wrote one of the most extraordinary truth posts of his presidency, referring, of course, to the 90-day pause. Lutnick goes on to say the world is ready to work with President Trump to fix global trade, and China has chosen the opposite direction. So again, suggesting a little bit there what they are looking at here. More than 75 nations, they say, have reached out to the U.S. just in the last week to try to negotiate on these tariffs, vowing not to retaliate, vowing to work together. And of course, they're very angry with Beijing for taking the opposite tack, vowing this retaliation. So far, everybody else, it seems like, is getting this 90-day pause. My read is that the 10% baseline tariff would stay in effect during this pause while the China gets the higher tariff. I also would just say, Kelly, that we do have to see some paperwork before this higher tariff on China could go into effect. The president would have to sign something on this.
Speaking at the White House, let's see if we can dip in.
The president just put out a statement announcing an additional tariff on China. The tariff on China will now go up to 125%. because China imprudently decided to retaliate against the United States. And as I said at the podium yesterday, when you punch at the United States of America, President Trump is going to punch back harder. In that same vein, we have had more than 75 countries from around the world reach out to President Trump and his team here at the White House to negotiate better trade deals for the American worker. We have been overwhelmed with the amount of requests from countries around the world. I'll let the Secretary speak to that. We will continue with the tailor-made negotiations that I spoke about yesterday. In the meantime, there will be a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs as these negotiations are ongoing, and the tariff level will be brought down to a universal 10% tariff. The Secretary here has been a huge part of the President's trade team, of course, and will continue to lead these negotiations moving forward to look out for the American worker, which is always President Trump's goal. So I'll kick it over to our great Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent.
Good, thank you. And we saw the successful negotiating strategy that President Trump implemented a week ago today. it has brought more than 75 countries forward to negotiate. It took great courage for him to stay the course until this moment. And what we have ended up with here, as I told everyone a week ago, in this very spot, do not retaliate and you will be rewarded. So every country in the world who wants to come and negotiate, we are willing to hear you. We're going to go down to a 10% baseline tariff for them, and China will be raised to 125 due to their insistence on escalation.
Ed, go ahead.
Treasury Secretary, thank you for doing this. Let me ask you three quick things, if I could, just for the sake of clarity, because the markets are open and they're wondering. First of all, Mexico and China, are they part of this 10% universal?
Well, China,
Mexico and Canada, are they part of the 10%?
Yes.
Okay. Second, given then that you have the rest of the world essentially calling it, it's not China, is this now just all about China?
Well, it's about bad actors, and what we will see is some of the very early countries are China's neighbors. That we're going to see. I'm seeing Vietnam today. Japan's at the front of the queue. South Korea, India. So we will see. And as I've repeatedly said, and President Trump has been saying it for years, China is the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world, and they are the biggest source of the U.S. trade problems. And indeed, they are problems for the rest of the world, because what we've seen is that as the U.S. announced the tariff wall last week, many of those goods have already started flooding into Europe.
So as you see it now, this trade war is China versus the rest of the world.
Well, I'm not calling it a trade war, but I'm saying that China has escalated, and President Trump responded very courageously to that, and we are going to work on a solution with our trading partners.
If I could just, excuse me, Raquel, if I could just add to what the Secretary said. Many of you in the media clearly missed the art of the deal. You clearly failed to see what President Trump is doing here. You tried to say that the rest of the world would be moved closer to China when in fact we've seen the opposite effect. The entire world is calling the United States of America, not China, because they need our markets, they need our consumers, and they need this president in the Oval Office to talk to them. And that's exactly why more than 75 countries have called, because the United States of America is the best place in the world to do business. And as the president has shown great courage, as the secretary has said, in choosing to retaliate against China even higher. Elena, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Treasury Secretary Bessent. Can you explain more of the decision-making on what feels like a reversal here? I mean, just these went into effect less than 15 hours ago, these tariffs. Why the pause now? What led to that?
No, again, President Trump created maximum negotiating leverage for himself, and which tariffs went into effect 15 hours ago? The ones that we have lowered went into effect a week ago. They were announced a week ago, and we've just been overwhelmed by the response from mostly our allies who want to come and negotiate in good faith. So we are expecting them to come with their best deal. As I said a week ago today, don't retaliate, hold your ground, let's see what happens. And China, they kept escalating, and now they have 125% tariffs that will be effective immediately.
Mr. Secretary,
Go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for doing this. The 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, is that because of the whiplash that we've been seeing across the financial markets? How much was, what we saw in the stock markets, a part of this decision?
No, it's because because of the large number of inbounds. We've had more than 75 countries contact us, and I imagine after today there will be more. So it is just a processing problem. Each one of these solutions is going to be bespoke. It is going to take some time, and President Trump wants to be personally involved. So that's why we're getting the 90-day pause.
Mr. Clarification. Mr. Secretary, there was a tweet that you and Secretary Lutnick were in the Oval Office with the President talking about this. Can you talk about what that conversation was like and what you guys said to one another that led to this decision?
Look, it's all the President's decision, and the President had a level in mind to raise the China tariffs, and then he had the 3-month, essentially the 3-month pause in mind, and we were discussing the exact wording. Sorry? Of course.
It's the president's decision.
It's the president's decision. It was the president's decision to wait until today. And again, as I've said in the past, no one creates leverage for himself like President Trump.
Mr. Secretary. Shelby, go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, what does the president want to see by this, I think it's July 9th deadline to keep things paused? Is it just trade barriers coming down, or is it more than that?
Well, these are trade negotiations, but if countries want to come and offer other things, I talked about yesterday that we are thinking about a big LNG project in Alaska that South Korea, Japan, Taiwan are interested in financing and taking a substantial portion of the offtake. But again, in essence, that is trade because it will decrease the trade deficit that we have with those countries. So everything's on the table.
Mr. President. Raquel, go
Secretary,
ahead.
a clarification on the pause. What happened to those countries who just had 10% baseline tariffs, like Brazil and others? Are they still going to have this 90-day pause? Because you were saying that there will be a tariff of 10% for others. So what happened to those who just had a 10%?
Yeah, that's going to remain.
And do you call this an embargo to China?
Pardon?
You call this an embargo to China, a trade embargo?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the word embargo.
125% tariffs, like those, and then it goes 84%. Isn't this an embargo?
Well, it's not. It's China's decision that we have the deficit with them. They sell us almost 5 times what we sell them. So again, I think it's an own goal by China.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, with this, does this signal that you're confident that you're going to be able to strike a satisfactory deal with all these 75 nations
It signals that President Trump cares about trade and that we want to negotiate in good faith. And as I said, each one of these is going to be a separate, bespoke negotiation. So we are confident that having seen the other side of where this could go, and it was like I said last week, the market didn't understand. Those were maximum levels. The countries can think about those levels as they come to us to bring down their tariffs, their non-tariff trade barriers. We're going to discuss currency manipulation, subsidy of labor, and industry.
Secretary, as far as you, will the pause also apply to the sectoral tariffs that the president has announced, pharma, lumber, anything else?
No, it's on the reciprocal.
So those will still be coming here soon, right?
Mr. Secretary,
as far as the negotiations with the 75
Andrea, go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, so I want to ask you about what you're doing here. So the market is reacting crazily, right?
I haven't seen it.
Do you think that this move is going to change or calm down the market reaction?
What?
Do you think the markets have tanked, right? There's been a lot of volatility in the market, not just in terms of stock markets, but also funds. So will this move, in your mind, you anticipate that this is going to calm the markets down?
Well, I think what we've seen, I think the willingness by more than 75 countries to come and negotiate, I think now the market understands that everything they saw last Wednesday was a ceiling, and now we have a 10%, the temporary floor, and I think the market, my 35 years in the market, I always wanted certainty, so I think we've got more certainty.
But Mr. Secretary, Maggie, go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, why do people assume this is the last word? The president began this morning saying, be cool. 5 hours later, he announces a new policy. Why will investors in the market assume that this is it?
Because, again, as I said, we've given 90 days, and the only certainty we can provide is that the U.S. is going to negotiate in good faith, and we assume that our allies will too. And in terms of certainty, we will see what China does. But what I'm certain of is that what China is doing will affect their economy much more than it will ours, because they have an export-driven, flood the world with cheap export models, and the rest of the world now understands, because when we put up our tariff wall, those exports were already flowing to the rest of the G7 and to the global south.
And you think
Mr. Secretary, how much of this decision was driven by the bond market cratering overnight? What is happening with bonds? Is China selling their bonds?
I have nothing that says that, and we actually had quite a good 10-year auction today, and all this was, again, this was driven by the president's strategy. He and I had a long talk on Sunday, and this was his strategy all along, and that, you might even say that he goaded China into a bad position. They responded. They have shown themselves to the world to be the bad actors, and we are willing to cooperate with our allies and with our trading partners who did not retaliate. It wasn't a hard message. Don't retaliate. Things will turn out well.
What's your message to
There's Politico articles saying that the countries were getting
these
called back.
negotiations with these 75 countries, how long will that take? Will it be a matter of weeks? Will it be a matter of months? Do you expect financial markets to be stable during that time period?
Well, we've started with a 90-day pause, and we will see if more countries turn up, what will happen. But we have a meeting with Vietnam today, and we have one of the largest trade deficits with them, so I'm hoping it will move in a good direction. I was at the Japanese ambassador's house last night for the Cherry Blossom Festival, which is quite festive, and he and I had a good chat. They are going to send a deal team over, so we'll see. These are complicated negotiations. These are imbalances that have taken decades to create, but I think having seen the maximum level that Donald Trump is willing to go to, President Trump has created this negotiating leverage.
Excuse me, everybody. Excuse me. The secretary is obviously a very busy man. As he has said, he's had more than 75 countries that the trade team has to respond to. I'd just like to end with this. For decades, Republicans and Democrats have said that these unfair trade practices are ripping off the American people, are ripping off our country, but nobody has ever done anything to address it. We finally have a president here at the White House who is playing the long game, who is doing what is right for the American worker and our industries here at home, and he has put together a fantastic team in Secretary Bessent, Secretary Leavitt, the entire trade team, who will be focusing on negotiating these good deals to put the American workers first, and we're going to get to work to do that. Thank you.
What about the EU? What about the EU? They retaliated this morning. Why aren't they being treated like China?
Secretary Bessent at an impromptu press conference at the White House with the press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, moments after the president announced on Truth Social that he will be winding or repealing or putting on pause the reciprocal tariffs, but leaving in place the 10% tariffs for now and ratcheting up tariffs on China. Eamon Javers is standing by at the White House. And Eamon, after a series of events like what we've seen, I think when people absorb the China tariffs still being into effect, they're still going to have to think through both the inflation, the growth aspects of that, the supply chain hit. But this is a huge about-face, a huge reaction in the markets. Perhaps it was the bond market, as the Treasury Secretary was asked about, that got the White House's attention after the sell-off we saw overnight. But regardless, what an extraordinary moment here.
Absolutely, Kelly, and I can tell you that nobody that I talked to in the West Wing today expected this. If this was the strategy all along, it was very tightly held in a very close circle of people. You heard the Treasury Secretary there say that he had a conversation with President Trump back on Sunday, in which the president indicated that it was his strategy to let the tariffs go into place on Wednesday today, and then announce this 90-day pause. Now, that indicates that they've been holding this secret for several days from the entire world. The Treasury Secretary also said that there's no way in which the bond market meltdown overnight affected this. He said we had a very good 10-year auction, and the bond market was not part of the concern, but the bond market meltdown certainly did get the attention of the world, Kelly. And I can tell you that what I'm looking at here is some of the palace intrigue of this announcement, right? Because it's unexpected, very sudden, but also who was at that microphone and who wasn't at that microphone. You saw the press secretary there, and you saw the Treasury secretary there. The person we didn't see is Peter Navarro, who's one of the architects of the tariff strategy. We also didn't see Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary, who's involved in a lot of White House meetings. Lutnick putting out a post on social media suggesting that he was in the room for this decision, but was not clearly asked by the president to go out to the microphones to explain it. That fell to Bessent, and we know that Bessent is the person who has been saying all along that this is a negotiation, that the president is open to talking with foreign trade competitors, and that Lutnick and Peter Navarro were the folks who were saying this is not a negotiation, this is all about a permanent regime change in global trade. So it looks like, to the extent there are factions inside this White House, this is the triumph of the Bessent faction, and the Peter Navarro faction is a little bit on the run here at the White House.
Eamon, appreciate it. With the Dow up 2,100 points, the NASDAQ at the highs was up almost 10%. Let's bring in Steve Leisman. Steve, because we were talking a moment ago about how complicated things are for the Fed. If this is telling us that growth is going to hang in there in the meantime, I guess it makes things a little easier for them. But we're also seeing the odds of a cut at the next meeting go up to almost 90%.
At the next meeting, that's not what I have. At the June meeting, I have.
June, thank you.
For the May meeting, it went down to 20%. It went down a little bit for the June meeting. I mean, look, you can say this is a relief, but there's another 90 days of uncertainty to come, which is worth it. And you could also try to spin this as a victory, or you could see this as a failure of policy and leadership on the part of the White House, Kelly, in the following way. I remember the night before the tariffs were imposed and the day and that day, and I asked our great White House reporter, Megan Casella, why we had heard nothing of the plan. And the reason I asked is it because they don't know or they're not saying? And what we found out since is they didn't know. The plan was made up that day. It was not nobody on Wall Street. They didn't run it by Wall Street. They didn't run it by business leaders and CEOs. And now you could argue, after withering punishment from markets, from bond markets, trillions lost across the globe, the president, he didn't just flinch, but he ducked when it came to what was coming his way here. So they can try to spin this as a victory, and maybe they have 75 calls. Maybe they get 75 trade deals. But it just seems to me that the other way to tell this story is that the president just flinched and did not run this by the markets, run this by the business, and he was facing a deep recession. I will point out there are still trillions lost from that day, Kelly. There's still quite a bit that's been lost here in terms of where we were just on April 3rd. We're still down, way down. These 10% tariffs, the market doesn't like these either. We didn't get that back yet.
Let's bring in Citi's Scott Cronert on that note. Steve, thanks. And Scott, I was just looking at some of the same charts Steve is referencing. So on the NASDAQ, we were up at 20,000. We're still, call it 15, the numbers are moving so quickly. Several thousand points off the high, 16,591. The S&P, same story. I mean, these were the 52-week highs when everyone was screaming that things were overvalued and frothy.